48. Seagroves and Pesht talked over the unfortunate and untimely death of their leader, though neither mercenary was particularly heartbroken at the loss. Seagroves was a bit put out at the destruction of the Lamb, but lacking jet fuel and without propulsion, the Lamb was just an overweight machine. And neither man was completely aware of the contract Faust had made. They decided to make the long hike back to Usagumo and start over. After all, the contract had been fulfilled. They'd driven the rebels over the mountains and destroyed their mechs. Though they couldn't be completely sure of that, there was no one to dispute their report. If natural predators and starvation didn't get them first, the Tatate and the deserters would probably freeze to death in the high mountains. The Panther and the Javelin turned west toward the distant plain. In the high mountains to the east, the ragged band of refugees staggered upward. The Locust had been pampered and coaxed into activity once more, but it moved with the unsteady gait of a tired man. It was no longer a smooth, even ride, but made rolling, halting steps that threatened to throw Dakota off his perch on the carapace. Service in and around the Locust was prized duty. Under normal conditions, the heat generated by the power plant was a danger to the operation of any mech of its class. Now, with the wind howling through the canyons with enough force to stagger the 20-ton mech and pluck the unwary from the narrow path, being near that warmth was a lifesaver. At night, when it became too dangerous to travel, the body of the Locust would squat low, the survivors huddling in its lee. At last they found and crossed the high pass. There was a celebration in the ranks, despite the difficulty in eking enthusiasm out of their chilled, exhausted bodies. There were those who thought it meant the trek was over, but the long, winding rifts that fell away promised more hardship and starvation. The chargers for the laser weapons continued to draw power each night from the fusion core of the Locust, so ammunition was no problem for Takuda. Horg discovered that the rifle, set on low power, could be drained into the rock strata, heating the stone to near incandescence. Around its heated surface, the frigid refugees would huddle until the most violent spasms of shivering passed. With the Locust's unlimited power, there was no worry about running out. The only worry, as expressed by Goodall and Jacobs to Takuda, was that the mech itself might fail. It was in danger of simply falling apart. In any other lance, it would have been consigned to depot maintenance for a good long rest, but they had no such luxury. Goodall commented that if she were in the real world, wherever that was, she'd be severely reprimanded for the condition of the mech. At last they found the trees again, the same mixed forest through which they'd passed almost a month ago. Food became more plentiful, and the Tatate happily began to forage for the others. Now the humans began to understand how valuable the bird-like aliens could be to their survival. The Tatate knew what the humans could eat and what they could not, and they brought in a bountiful supply of edibles. Movement had become faster, and the Locust, no longer freezing in the joints, made good time. Dakota kept them headed in the direction he alone seemed to understand. Even when some of the Tatate complained that this area or that area was good enough, he refused to settle. Somewhere, perhaps not too far, was the far country of the Edler settlement. There was no stopping him now. The Locust staggered to the top of a sharp ridge where Dakota could view the broad grass and forest land that lay beyond. At last, he seemed satisfied. Here, in the broad valley, was the far country he sought. It was here, he said, that they would find the others. Jacobs and Goodall activated the sensor system that had been shut down and ignored for so many days. There was an immediate response. Jacobs and Goodall stared at the secondary screen. There was no doubt about the target reply. A solid metallic response from beyond the normal limit of sensor range. The sensors could send an inquiry and receive a response faster than the secondary screen could read and analyze the reply. but the screen would still show that there was something beyond its maximum scan, and it could only be something very large. It could only be a mech, and the only other mechs on the planet were those of the mercenaries. Somehow the mercs had swept the flank and were now waiting for them in the area Takuda's people planned to call their home. The whole trek, the fighting, the dying, the starvation, freezing, and exhaustion had been for naught. There must have been an easier way to reach this plane than the high passes over the mountains. Takuda climbed stiffly into the cockpit to confirm the sensor target. There was no doubt about the nature of the signature. Only a huge metallic object made a response like that. He examined his resources and began to plan. The original desk team had been reduced to 7, counting Parker Davood, which everyone did, and all had been wounded or injured in some way. Frostbite was a common denominator. Then there were the crushed fingers, swollen joints, sprains, and muscle pulls. Arsenal was being carried by 4 Tatate, the spear wound never having received the medicine to speed its repair. At least gangrene had not set in. Paul Tesseract was still carrying the laser rifle, with his trusty Tatate power pack bearer close behind. Andy Holland still hobbled from injuries taken more than a month before. She too had suffered from the lack of time and medicine. Takuda was too tired, too disappointed by the signature, to come up with any plan other than going straight at him. The others agreed. It would be all or nothing. With the Locust in support, the desk members spread out over the terrain and began to sweep forward. It would take a full day to reach the rebound point of the response. Unless, of course, the enemy mechs came toward them. The forest was high climax, and the going beneath the branches was easy for the infantry. It was harder for the Locust because it was right up among the tops of the trees. Finally, Jacobs climbed out of the cockpit to sit where Dakota had spent much of the last month. Under his direction, the Locust was able to maintain its supporting position behind the infantry. Goodall kept the return centered on the screen, using it as the guiding star for navigation. The constant return was a mesmerizing dot that drew her eyes until it became all she could see. She did not even notice the scrolling information that appeared shortly after noon. Finally, she snapped herself out of her trance and paid attention. She brought the Locust to an abrupt halt. A stop so sudden that Jacobs nearly lost his handhold on the outer hull. He crawled back into the cockpit after his complaints drew no response. Goodall was transfixed by the data screen. She turned to Jacobs as he squirmed his way into the tiny space. "Get to Kuda," she said without looking up. "He's got to see this." Jacobs moved quickly to find the commander and bring him to the Locust. When Takuda had made his way into the cramped cockpit and taken the seat relinquished by Goodall, he watched the identification information scroll over the display. He, too, was astonished. The target they had been stalking was not a hostile mech. It wasn't even a mech. The information on the screen identified the rebound as coming from a Vulture-class dropship. The name that flashed onto the screen in reply to the electronic query identified the vessel as the Combine dropship Hideyoshi Toyotomi, registration number DC445/157-AKA. A computer scan of the Locust Limited Information Bank could not identify the Vulture class. As a best guess, based on the radar and IR sensor scan, the computer gave the Seeker as the closest possibility because the size, mass, and propulsion were close. The Seeker had been introduced in 2762, but the Vulture was obviously a much earlier model if it had been in operation in the 2500s. There was no sign of life around the ship. By evening, the refugees had closed on the target. It sat like a huge metal egg, 130 meters tall and 100 wide. In solitary splendor, it dominated a broad expanse of chest-high Kusa. Knight tapped on the interlock of the ship's personnel access door, and the portal opened at once. The smell of stale air rushed over him, and he paused for a moment before entering, almost expecting someone to protest his breaching of the seal. Only silence greeted him. Takuda and his troops poured into the dropship, eager to discover all they could about what it was and where it had come from, and where the people who had once crewed it. Almost immediately, they came upon the human remains. These had been so well preserved in the climate controlled environment that they were almost like unwrapped mummies, rigid at their stations or in their bunks. The computer log would hold the key. Takuda called all the desk members of the command bridge to the command bridge of the Hideyoshi Toyotomi, where they would unlock the ship's mystery. He waited until all were gathered, then pressed the pressure-sensitive log screen to bring up the most recent entry. The screen glowed to life, and the face of a handsome man, his features strained by fatigue and resignation, filled the square. This is the last entry of the log of the Hideyoshi Toyotomi, which departed from the planet Salford in the year 2510. We were docked to the Draconis Combine jump ship Raiden. The jump ship encountered a cosmic accident of some kind, and we misjumped into the system. With the Raiden breaking up, we abandoned the jump ship and made our way here. We believe that we are the only survivors. A breach in the pressure hull killed many of those on board, but we were able to land safely. We have survived that for 1 year at this location, but our comlink inquiries were never answered. We have discovered no sentient life with whom to communicate. It has become obvious that we will die here, for we have no way to reproduce. There were a dozen women aboard ship when we made the jump, but the breach in the pressure hull took the lives of all of them. Thus, we are a society of 25 men. We will not survive. Rather than die old and useless, we have decided that seppuku is the honorable way to depart this life. We will close the ship against the indignities of the environment, and we will reduce power output to the lowest point. We trust that at some time, when we are discovered, the Hideyoshi Toyotomi will be in a condition to bring honor to its crew. This is Captain and Master Pama Tohoku of the Draconis Combine ship Hideyoshi Toyotomi, wishing good luck to those who find us. Signing off. Takuda and the rest stood in silence as the transmission ended. This was the nugget at the heart of the legend. It was one of those who had fallen from the sky with fire. The survivors had not become a society that would save the Tatate, at least not by their action. But perhaps they had, in their own way, given the little bird people a chance to live a life of freedom and security. Here, far across the mountains, it would be years, perhaps decades, before the humans of the vast plains ventured this far. Here, they would have the fresh start they so needed. But there was now the question of the humans themselves. Here, sitting silent and barely alive, was a transport that could free them of this planet. Perhaps it would be possible to reach one of the stranded jump ships now hanging as orbital junk above the planet. Perhaps there was a way off. And even if they could not reach the ships or get them operational, there was another habitable planet within the star system. They could go there.